Hi, friends. Welcome to Bar of the Conference. I'm your host, Derek Scott III. Today's episode is with Lonnie Brooks. Lonnie is a layperson in the Alaska Missionary Conference in the Western jurisdiction. He's been involved in the United Methodist Church all of his life, but since retiring in 1994, he has devoted his time to serving the church at multiple levels. Lonnie really has seen it all, and he brings a wealth of experience and perspective to the conversation that we're cultivating on this podcast. As we were getting ready to hit record, Lonnie said that his major goal has been to be an agitator and thorn in the side of the UMC. For some of us, that's interesting, and for others, that's annoying. But I believe it actually comes from an extremely genuine place. As I listened to Lonnie, it was clear to me that he thinks deeply about the UMC. He prays regularly for the UMC, and he definitely loves the UMC. You may not agree with Lonnie on some minor or major points, but the truth is Lonnie is still here trying to help us be all that we can be for the sake of the gospel. As we talked in this interview, my respect for Lonnie grew immensely. But heads up, we are going to go deep into the weeds on some things. So you're definitely going to need that notebook and maybe a stronger choice beverage. So get ready for a deeply informative episode with Lonnie Brooks. Lonnie Brooks, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm well, thank you, Derek. It's my great pleasure to be with you today.
Oh, man, it's all the pleasure's mine. I am so grateful that you're willing to join me on the podcast. Alaska is a state in the U.S., but it still feels like it's a distance away. And so knowing that that's where you are, I feel like it's a huge leap. But I'm really grateful that you're willing to join me because I do believe that you've got, I know you've got a ton of experience and history within the United Methodist Church. And I think you will bring some additional perspective to this conversation that we're trying to cultivate on Bar of the Conference. I know a little bit about Lonnie Brooks from the different articles that you've written and things like that, but would love to hear how you became a follower of Jesus, a United Methodist Christian, and just the ways God's prevenient grace had been active in your life to bring you into our denomination.
Totally prevenient. Yeah, it had almost nothing to do with it from a point of view of choice. I was born into a practicing Methodist family from both sides, my mother's side and my father's side. They were members, actually, of the First United Methodist Church, the First Methodist Church in those days in Orlando, Florida, and had me baptized there as soon as the pastor was willing to do that. And I grew up in the church. In fact, my earliest memory of anything was of my mother having set me down before I could walk on the floor in the nursery at that church, and my crawling in, excitedly looking for the blocks and stuff I was going to play with that morning. And many of my memories of growing up years were around things in the church. And so it was just part of my growing up and the expectations that the family had that I would be in church every time they were there, which is basically every time the doors opened. And my father, in fact, was a singer in a quartet, a gospel quartet, and they traveled all over Central Florida to sings, as they call them, or all-day sings, and they would have dinner on the grounds, and I participated in that. Then I grew up participating in the youth program there at First Church, and in fact, when I decided what I was going to do with my life and how I would prepare for that, I determined I was going to be a missionary, that I was going into mission work with the church, and went to Georgia Tech to study engineering with the focus on going into missions as an engineer. And when I graduated there, I went to Perkins School of Theology with the idea I needed a theological background for this kind of path I'd set for myself. However, when I was there at Perkins, I had an opportunity to interview a staff member of the Board of Missions. And after talking with me for about 45 minutes, he let me know that the thing that they would have in mind for me to do would be to teach math and science in a high school somewhere in the mission field. And I thought, well, that's really a great mission for somebody, but not for me. I didn't see that as any kind of a fulfillment of what I had in mind to do. So I decided, after some discernment and talking to my counselors there at Perkins, that I would leave seminary and find another mission. And I did that, and I ended up going around the world looking for oil to replace the energy of human muscle with energy from the earth. And so that was my focus for 32 years. And then came back after I retired to spend, I'd say, essentially full-time work in the church, except as a volunteer. I don't get paid for what I do in the church. So that's where I'm now. Thank you, Derek, for asking.
No, I'm grateful, as a lay leader in the Florida Conference, always wanting to make sure we're creating space and thinking about the ways that laity can contribute to the life of our church, but also being aware that sometimes our system has a way of putting a lid on laity as they are discerning and discovering all the things that God wants to do in and through them. So there's something helpful in even this idea of you having kind of a vision of what you thought God was calling you into, and we just didn't have the categories yet to really create that kind of space for you.
Yeah, I was probably premature, but and even as much as the system does try to put a lid on, people sometimes have a way of breaking through the lids.
Well, that part too. So you're in Anchorage, Alaska, serving the United Methodist Church up there. I'm just curious, what is the unique sort of context of ministry in Alaska as a United Methodist?
We're unique in terms of our size, for sure. In fact, we've had clerics come in, and all our clerics in Alaska are members of another home conference, and then they serve in an associate capacity in Alaska. They come in and they look around and they say, is this all there is? I can really do a lot here. And you do get that feeling that because we're small, we have a chance to be perhaps more impactful in the smaller setting. You get to be a bigger fish in a smaller pond, I suppose, is one way to look at it. But I think also the idea that we're still so much of a frontierish kind of a setting here gives people a sense that there aren't any limits that you have to worry about. That what you dream is what you can actualize if you have the drive and the skills to go after that dream. And you're going to find some people who will support you in that process as well here. Yeah, that part may not be unique, but it's unusual if not unique. So that's part of what makes it that way, Derek, I think.
I am jumping around a little bit, and I appreciate you going with me. With the different places that you've lived, have you been able to maintain your connection to the UMC across your travels and living in different cities?
Oh, the big answer is yes. A tiny piece of that I have to equivocate a little on. But when we were in Calgary, there was an agreement back, I don't know, 100 years ago, so nearly, I guess, now, that the Methodist Church in Canada and the Presbyterian Church in Canada would merge to become the United Church of Canada. So
Right.
when we were in Calgary, we were not United Methodists for a year and a half, and we were members of a United Church, which is an extremely welcoming church. We were incredibly overcome, really, with the kindness and the welcome that we received. But during that short year and a half, we were United Church of Canada members, not United Methodists, and then resumed United Methodist membership upon coming back to Anchorage. But yeah, when we were in Saudi Arabia for 3 months and Canada all that time, no, we were still United Methodists at heart, if not fully in membership.
I think just a little bit you've shared with me, I might be jealous of your passport and all the places that you've been. How, it seems to me, it would be easy for a lot of people to just be members of a local congregation. But you've been engaged in more than that for decades, right? Like annual conferences and jurisdictional, even general conference. We'll talk a little bit about the dynamics related to those, but why, Lonnie? Why give so much time to these spaces outside of Sunday morning and outside of a local congregation?
I saw fairly early on in my work in the church, and I'm talking way back when I was in high school even, and becoming very active there in Orlando at First Church, that there were a lot of things that were decided in terms of policy about how the church would operate that were made beyond the level of the local church. And that if I were going to have any kind of an impact in what those decisions were going to be, that I would need to be involved at some point in my life in the church beyond the level of the local church. And so that became an evolutionary kind of a thing too. Action doesn't always coincide with realization of the need. And that was certainly true in my case. In fact, we were members at First United Methodist Church in Santa Monica for a time while we were stationed there in Los Angeles. And that was, I guess I was in my mid to late 30s at that time. And the pastor there asked me if I was ready to be a member of the administrative board. And I told him, gee, Paul, I'd really love to do that. But right now I just feel like I'm too busy. But that was an eye opener for me, that there was an opportunity there for me as a young man, even to become involved. And where I didn't take that chance, which I regret now looking back on, by the time then I got involved in the church in Alaska, which wasn't that many years later, less than 10 years later, I thought, I should have said yes to Paul. I didn't. And so now I'm going to start saying yes. And so I did. And it just grew from there into activity, from going from the local church to becoming a member of the annual conference, and then seeing that, the church is bigger even than this, and being driven to accept some of the jobs at the general level.
As a layperson, have you experienced barriers to entry and being involved? Sometimes not intentional, I believe, and then maybe even at times intentional, just by nature of the fact that the UMC can be somewhat clergy-centric at times.
Absolutely, Derek, you're right as rain on that. It is clergy-centric, not only in scheduling but in format as well. The expectation is that to have an impact, you need to be comfortable with speaking in public, and half of the members of all these conferences that we're going to be involved in are made up of clergy people who are, in general, that there are some exceptions to this, but in general, they get paid to speak in public for a living. That's what they do.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So, unless you're in a lay position like being a lawyer or something like that, usually we're not trained in that way. And so you have a barrier there to overcome to have an impact on the process. But the fact also obtains that in our annual conferences, which is defined as the basic body of the church, the clergy are always members. They don't have to be elected once a year, once a quadrennium to these positions. By having been accepted as members of the clergy, they're members of the conference. That's where their basic membership is. And so they're always there, and there is power in tenure. And laypersons don't have this. There are some of us who have worked ourselves into the system so that we usually are there, but it's different. There is a tremendous turnover in all our annual conferences of who the lay members are, which is not true for the clergy. But then true too, in addition to just tenure and being there at the conference, there's also a cohesiveness that obtains within the clergy by the fact that they're always there. That doesn't happen with the lay persons. And the lay people are going always to be seen as outsiders to some degree from this camaraderie, cadre, I'd even say, of clergy who run it. In fact, I remember one time in the Alaska Conference, we were having a debate over, I don't even remember now what the issue was, but it was something that was significant. And so I got up to make my speech, and there was a cleric not from Anchorage, but from somewhere else in Alaska. So he took the floor and basically said, I think now it's time for you to sit down and shut up. I don't have to make that up. Yeah. So, and I was basically the only layperson who had been engaged in the debate that was in process on that. So that was as overt as that bias has ever been expressed, but it was there. So we do have to contend with that as lay people in being effective in an annual conference.
So, I mean, that story is a lot. And I can imagine if it were me in that moment, having to mitigate and deal with some personal feelings, even as, just trying to stay in the room and stay on topic, keep the focus on the thing that's being debated. And I would imagine, Lonnie, that you've had moments where the debate and just the ways that we at times that we conference because we're passionate, it can get emotionally difficult. And I'm wondering if that has been your experience, and if it has, how have you worked with that? How have you been able to stay at the table when passions are bumping into each other in conferencing spaces?
It's really difficult to do that. And yet at the same time that we know that it's difficult, we also know that in order to be our most effective, we do have to keep a curb on our emotions to some degree, because you come across as more effective, and it's counterintuitive, the less passionate you are in certain ways. Now, mind you, there is a time and a place for expressing the passion that goes with the with the task. But in most cases, I find that it's better to keep that to a minimum in presenting the idea and focus, as you indicated in the question, focus on the issue rather than the people. That's in fact, I have a kind of a mantra that I refer to from time to time, that a good idea is a good idea regardless of the source, and a bad idea is a bad idea regardless of the source. And as long as we can focus on the merit of the idea being presented rather than the identity of the person who's presenting the idea, the more effective we're likely to be in terms of promoting the concept that we're supporting.
I'm going to hold on to that. But Lonnie, you've watched the United Methodist Church literally take shape. At least the United Methodist Church that we live in, you've watched it take shape during your lifetime and tenure as a leader. And we'll talk specifically about some things that have happened over the years, particularly at general conferences, but I'd just love to hear your thoughts on the structure of our church, the way we connect to each other across the planet. And I just love some just general thoughts of both its gifts, but also its challenges from your perspective.
I have watched the church take shape. In fact, the Methodist Church itself was born only a year before I was, in 1939. I was born in 1940. And then just a few short years later, in 1968, we created the United Methodist Church, and I was living in California, happily engaged in my work as an oil exploration geophysicist when that happened, but significantly involved in the church on the local church level at that time, but fully aware of what was happening in the church, that we were creating a new thing here from the Evangelical United Brethren Church and the Methodist Church coming together to form this new entity, the United Methodist Church. And of course, one of the celebrations that I certainly was part of, in terms of how I felt about it, at least, was that with that merger, we did away with the central jurisdiction, which had been the shame of the area of the country in which I grew up, down in the southeast, which the central jurisdiction was essentially the old Methodist Episcopal Church South, encapsulated in that one region of the country. And that was basically the original sin of the Methodist Church. And I had not realized that as a young boy. But when I entered my teen years, I began to be exposed to what that meant in terms of discrimination and exclusion. And so I was I was ready, as ready as any person can be, for that to come to an end. And of course it did, nominally, although that's not to say that discrimination came to an end with the end of the central jurisdiction. We're still struggling with that today. In fact, I see that as one of the things that remains for us to do. I see looking forward, as much as we've come, we haven't come far enough. And I think that the jurisdictional system that was created in 1939 to enshrine the separation was flawed, terminally flawed. And I don't think that we can go forward with the jurisdictional system with a full sense of commitment to ending racism. I think we need to do something different. And that's what I think the value is in the proposals that are before us now for regionalizing the United Methodist Church in a different sense, in a completely different way. In fact, the heart of the proposal is to do something similar worldwide that we have, at least to some degree, with the central conferences. That we're going to, the proposal is that we turn each of the central conferences into a regional conference, and that we make a regional conference in the United States. And I think we need to take that piece a step further and replace the jurisdictional system with regional conferences within the United States. I don't think we need to have 5 of them. I think we need a more modest number than that, and put that whole idea of jurisdictions behind us where it needs to be.
Wow. Lonnie, you're giving me all the thoughts here. So much to think about there. What is it like in the Western jurisdiction as it exists today for you in Alaska? And you know, I'm interested in that geographic distance. Just the ways that often I hear people talking about the lower 48 when I connect with my other friends in Alaska, and just that geographic distance. And then I imagine, because of the context of what it is to do life in ministry in that state, it looks drastically different from doing ministry, say, in Southern California. And so, or even in Seattle, right? Like, so what, give me a little bit of what that is like to engage on the jurisdictional level from where you sit in Anchorage.
There's some real challenges here. We have a very limited road system in Alaska. So we have many of our churches that are located in places where there is no ground transportation for most of the year from Anchorage to these places. You can fly in there, you can boat in there, but you can't drive into there. And in fact, that's true of the capital of the state. Juneau is not accessible by road from Anchorage, and almost all the southeast region of the state is not accessible by road. So we've got those challenges. But despite the challenge that's there, we have in Alaska, we've seen the handwriting on the wall, as it were, that the ministry in the way that we've conceived of it in the past, of having Alaska as a separate conference, is not sustainable into the future. And so we've launched ourselves on a path of becoming a district of the Pacific Northwest Annual Conference. We went through a period of discernment, a long period of discernment. When I say that, I mean like over 20 years of coming to the realization and then deciding that's actually what we wanted to do and how to do it, and what conference should we be allied with and become part of. And we had leaders in Desert Southwest and Phoenix and Southern California saying, well, we'll take Alaska if you want to join us. But for reasons of affinity and kinship from long past, we settled on Pacific Northwest as where we'd like to go. And they've they've been welcoming and supportive. The obstacle that we faced was primarily, as it so often is, institutional, because a missionary conference, which is what we are, can only be created, which means also uncreated, by the General Conference. So we have to have a General Conference approval before we can dissolve our status as a missionary conference and then be aligned within the boundaries, new boundaries set to put us as part of the Pacific Northwest Conference. And of course, we haven't been able to hold a General Conference. So we haven't been able to get past that barrier of having General Conference approve it. We've got an assurance from the General Board of Global Ministries that has some oversight responsibility for missionary conferences, that they will support our proposal to General Conference to change our status so that we can become a district of Pacific Northwest Annual Conference. And now we're going through what we call here in Alaska our living into becoming a district as we seek institutional approval for that change of status for us. So we're increasing our cooperative work even as we're waiting with PNW, and we're having folks from Alaska now serving on some of the boards and agencies in Pacific Northwest, getting ready for the time when we will be there. We'll still have the challenge of distances. And in fact, in one sense, it'll be more of a challenge because when the annual conference time comes, we've got our between 50 and 60 lay and clergy members from Alaska that we'll either have to get to Seattle or somewhere down there wherever they choose to meet, or we'll have to think of a new way to be in conference. And of course, we're open to those ideas as well. There might be some opportunity for us not to be physically present so much as electronically gathered. But we're open to those ideas. Still exploring.
You know, I think this is obviously a unique situation that you all find yourselves in, but I just wonder, as we continue to evolve over the next few years, in what ways might we be learning from Alaska's living into moving from being an annual conference to a missionary conference to a district? In what ways are y'all giving us lessons and things that we can learn from across the connection? So I appreciate you sharing all of that. Thinking about the General Conference, and we'll talk more specifically about what's happening right now, but as I was getting ready for this interview, I had not realized how closely connected you were to Plan UMC that came before the General Conference in 2012. And so to the degree that you want to share, and feel free to only share so much, because I'm aware of how Plan UMC kind of, how it came to an end, unfortunately. But can you give me a little bit of your interaction and leadership with that plan, and what you had hoped it would bring to our denomination?
I'd be delighted to do that, Derek, because I think that's an important piece in the process that we're engaged in now, even as we seek a way forward for our church. Plan UMC was a development that really began with the decision of the connectional table to come forward with a new structural plan for the general agencies of the church. And they formed what they call the interim operations team to put together a plan, and that was a focused effort to reduce expense, but increase accountability, and to, I guess you'd say, focus leadership in a new way. And in fact, what they actually came up with the Interim Operations Team Plan, IOT we'll call it, as it was called then, the IOT plan was to have only one board of directors for all the general agencies combined, and have a person at the top of that structure then functioning as a chief executive. A lot of people in the United Methodist Church don't even know we don't have a chief executive, which is unique. I was involved heavily in the ecumenical work of the church for a long time. And virtually every other church that we deal with has someone at the top that is identifiable as a head of communion. That's usually the word the phrase that's used to designate and identify that person. Well, the fact is the United Methodist Church doesn't have a head of communion. For some purposes, when we're talking to the Presbyterians or the Lutherans or anybody else, we say, well, you can kind of think of as the president or a council of bishops as a head of communion, but not so you'd really notice if you're inside the church. But yeah, you can call him if you want, or her, or whoever it is. So we didn't have that, but the IOT plan was to create that position, as well as consolidate leadership into one board. Well, there were several of us who were looking at that, and they said there's some real merit in some of this, but one board for 13 or 14 agencies, I can't remember for sure which number it was right now, but for that many boards might be a bit extreme. Can we come up with an alternative that has the best of what we saw in the IoT plan, but perhaps soften some of that around the edges? And so we came up with an alternative that we wanted to propose, and we called it Plan B because we couldn't think of a better name, really. That's Plan A. We'll call this, ours is going to be Plan B. So we went to General Conference then in 2012 with, there were basically these two plans, but there was another group, the Methodist Federation for Social Action, also came up with an alternative plan that was sort of between the two. It wasn't as extreme in consolidation as IoT plan, but it was significantly different from Plan B as well. So we had those three plans then that found their way to conversation then at the General Administrative Legislative Committee, where all these plans ended up for conversation. And our strategy then with Plan B was to very early on, as early as we could get the floor in that legislative committee, to move our Plan B as a substitute for the motion that was there to adopt the IoT plan. And with very little conversation and very little discussion of it, that motion carried. And Plan B was substituted for the IoT plan for conversation on the floor then at that legislative committee. That was as easy as it got. It really bogged down from there.
Yeah.
The legislative committee really got mired in the details of trying to perfect that plan then, to the point that we came to the end of it with no plan coming out of the legislative committee proposed for adoption by the plenary. So then those of us who were supporting Plan B and those of us who were supporting the IoT plan said, we got to fix this. We cannot go. And we had several of the bishops coming and saying, you got to do something here. So in the time-honored way of the smoky back room at General Conference, we had selected some leaders from both the two plans, the Plan B and IoT plan, and we got together and we just all night for 2 nights in a row, we just worked together and we said, we're going to do this. And I drew the straw to come up with the draft of what it was going to be. And so I had done all the writing work on Plan B to start with. And so that was not an easy step, but we said, that's the architecture we'll use. We're going to take these parts of the IoT plan, we're going to merge them into the Plan B. And the we, in this case, it was me. I had to do that.
Yeah.
And Neil Alexander, who was a member of the IoT group, made the resources of the United Methodist Publishing House available there. And we just sat there all night putting this thing together. Mm. And that was then the plan that was presented to the conference and was fairly resoundingly adopted by the conference. It wasn't really a very close vote. It was by a significant margin, maybe not 2/3, but close to that, adopted. And then, of course, as you know, from the history, that the Judicial Council then came in and made its ruling that it was not constitutional on various grounds it cited. The surprise to me in the ruling, I wasn't actually surprised, was that rather than do what the Judicial Council normally does and say, this piece is unconstitutional for this reason, and if that gets fixed, this is going to be all right. They didn't do any of that. They just said it's unconstitutional. And the message was, although it wasn't ever said, articulated directly, because we don't have time to fix it, kind of thing. So it just was abandoned, much to the detriment of the church. I think some of the consolidations that were proposed in the agency structure of the church in that plan would have helped the church adapt more easily to what we're facing now because of the budget crunch that's coming. We've got a proposal from the General Counsel on Finance Administration, GCFA, to reduce the budget by as much as 30% from the previous budget, which we adopted back in 2016. Even the connectional table is saying there needs to be a significant reduction. Well, no organization can go through a 30% budget cut and come out the other side looking the same. It's just not going to be the same. And I think what we're going to end up with is a structure that looks a whole lot like what was proposed in Plan UMC, the merger of Plan B and IoT plan.
I cannot imagine all the time and energy and work and conferencing in the most ideal sense and conferencing in the most difficult sense. I can't imagine all that it took to bring a significant piece of legislation to the floor, to see it pass, and then to hear that it's not constitutional. None of it's worth working on or perfecting it. And for whatever reason, and then you're still here, Lonnie.
Yeah. Well, there have been some encouraging things along the way. Robert Schnese, Bishop Robert Schnese, was one of the people who was one of our champions there. And yeah, he, in one of his publications, I don't even remember which book now, said, in 2012, we had a bold new plan for restructuring the church that was struck down by the system. And when you hear things like that, you think, yeah, he's talking about me.
Wow.
So there's some encouragements.
Let's take a quick break. Lonnie, remind me, were you a General Conference delegate to the special session in 2019?
I was not. I was a first reserve lay delegate. However, that was almost simultaneously with my diagnosis with lymphoma. So I was not able to go physically to St. Louis to join the festivities. I had to watch it on TV, which I did. I was, even though I was sick. In fact, I was in the process of getting ready that morning to get on the airplane to go to St. Louis, when I looked at my wife and I said, I'm really sick here. I don't think I can even get dressed. And I was throwing up and all kind of things. And it turned out that this cancer was concentrated in my stomach. So I had to call the airline and tell them I wasn't going to show up. So that was the first the general conference I had not attended since 2000. I've been at every general conference since then, except for 2019.
Wow. And prayers for your continued health and recovery. And
thank you. According to my oncologist, I'm in complete remission right now. So
praise God.
Good for me. Thank you.
So I cannot imagine what it must have been like to watch those proceedings from where you were and all that you were personally dealing with. But in the midst of all of that, when the traditional plan passed in 2019, the special session, what were your thoughts? What were your feelings?
I was mostly lament because I didn't see that resolved much of anything. What most of us who have been close observers of the process had been hoping was that the Commission on a Way Forward would come to the church with a plan. And so there was great disappointment in the circles in which I was moving and working at the time over the fact that they came forward with three plans, the traditional plan, the one church plan, and then the connectional conferences plan. Although I saw some flaws and some weaknesses among those three, I thought that by far the one that the church would profit most from would be adopting the one church plan. So I was disappointed, as were most of the people that I worked closely with for a long time in the church, over the fact that the traditional plan was adopted. Like many people, I had analyzed all three to great extent anyway, and I was convinced that there were some significant flaws in constitutionality with the traditional plan. And of course, immediately it was, even before it was adopted, there was a question for the Judicial Council about its constitutionality, and much of it was declared to be unconstitutional. But there was a whole lot of it that was adopted that strengthened the church's stand against ordaining and appointing LGBTQIA plus people, as well as prohibiting our clergy from conducting same-sex unions and weddings. And so that was a disappointment. I never expected that. And as a centrist, I've never been fully supportive of the idea of requiring that our clergy marry anybody to whom they object. And up until the prohibition was adopted against our clergy performing same-sex unions, the discretionary authority for deciding whom a cleric should marry has always rested with the cleric. It's been every pastor's prerogative to decide whether he or she will conduct that wedding or not. Mm-hmm. And we changed that with that one point. If they're same sex, you can't marry them. So I never expected we would go to the point of, or had hoped anyway, that we would go, had not hoped that we would go the way of mandating that a cleric marry somebody. But what I had hoped all along was that we would do something like what Adam Hamilton had proposed. Oh, I don't know, it's probably 20 years ago now, when he came forward with his proposal for a way forward. That's what he called it, which was essentially a local option. And in case of each clergy person would have the very local option, what he or she would do, so that, and he left it somewhat open, the idea of what local meant, and how big of an area is local. But anyway, that would not be at General Conference, that we'd make decisions on leaving it to bishops to decide who's going to be appointed, leave it to annual conferences to decide who's going to be ordained, and leave it to pastors to decide who's going to be married, and the local churches whether or not they would host these kinds of weddings. So that's where many of the people with whom I was most closely in contact with had hoped that we would go. Well, that's not where we went. And the adoption of the traditional plan and the survival of the traditional plan, the pieces of it that did survive the review by the Judicial Council, were a step backward. We made it more difficult for clergy to protest and to stand alone in their individual choices. Now, mind you, fortunately, from my point of view, fortunately, and I say that with some reluctance because I am committed to the way of law rather than the way of humans in how we're governed. But I see that we've been boxed into a corner with no choice but to be in some form of ecclesial disobedience with respect to full inclusion. And we are intentionally and openly not complying with these new restrictions in much of the church. And of course, that's not exactly a new thing. We were not in compliance before the adoption of the new restrictions either. But in any case, that's really where we are now, with much of the church in open defiance of the current stand of the church, which causes huge stresses on the system.
Yeah.
And it's totally uncertain right now how we're going to resolve that. What we know is that the church is in the process. We don't have to say the church is going to. The church is in the process of separating. And it doesn't matter, in my point of view, whether you call this a schism, a separation, or a splintering. It's all the same. The church is dividing, whatever we choose to label that as. And it will not ever be the same again. We know that. We don't yet know what the shape will be going into the future of the, as it's sometimes styled using the language of the protocol, the post-separation United Methodist Church. We don't know what that's going to look like yet. We know it's going to be smaller, and we know it's going to be different, but we don't know in what way, for sure.
Lonnie, the plan that passed, the 2019, is called the Traditional Plan. You've identified yourself as a centrist. There are folks who put me in the progressive camp. Are these labels helpful as we're trying to figure out where we're going as a denomination, in your view?
I do find some utility in these labels. And the thing is, I think they're helpful in that they identify something about a population. They are not helpful in terms of identifying any individual in that population. But it's helpful in terms of the general trend of a population. It is useful to think in terms of that there is a segment of the church that is on the progressive end of a spectrum, and that there's a group that's on the traditional end of a spectrum, and that where there are two ends, there are going to be a middle, and you're going to call them something, and calling them centrist is useful. Now, mind you, when I identify myself as a centrist, I'm just saying I'm kind of in that population that's in the center between the two ends. But the truth is that if you get into the details of my theology and my polity, you'll find that I'm a creature that nobody would accept on either position, because in some respects, I am more progressive than most of the people who would self-identify as progressive, and I am more conservative than many of the people in some respects on the other end of it would identify themselves as being. And I'm a creature that's not even supposed to exist. I'm a political and, in some sense, social conservative, but theologically, most of the progressives, I would say, would consider me a heretic, way out on the other end. So,
I'd love to bear that out a little bit. I think that there are people who would agree with you and feel sort of an affinity of either being too progressive or not progressive enough for the progressives, and being way more traditionalist or not traditionalist enough for the traditionalists. But it's that feeling of like not really having a camp. But is there an example of how that's kind of been, how that's happened for you, how that's borne out in the last few years of our church conflict?
yes, I think the details of that are that I find myself not really accepted by either end. I'm considered by most of the progressives to be too conservative, and by most of the conservatives, I'm considered to be way too liberal. And they're looking at pieces of me rather than the whole of me when they make these judgments. The progressives see me as a registered Republican, and that they don't like anything to do with anybody who's a Republican. And of course, in some ways, many people who are not in the part of the Republicanism that I would identify with think if you're a Republican, that means you're a Donald Trumper. Well, that's as far from the truth as it could be for me, and for many of the other people that I know in the Republican circles within which I move. And on the conservative side, the conservatives would see my theological position with respect to their position on use of Scripture as way, way too liberal to suit them, so that I would be totally unacceptable. So I'm as far as you can be away from biblical literalism and rigorous that kind of interpretation of use of Scripture. Mm-hmm. So that's the way in which I see myself not fitting either camp.
Yeah. Do you mourn that? Do you wish it were different? Is that kind of the way you like it? How does that land for you?
I find myself having been reconciled to it and comfortable with where I am in that regard. I'm not unhappy to be a loner. And it kind of goes with my my basic orientation on the whether you're an extrovert or an introvert. I'm very much of an introvert. I'm really comfortable sitting in my office here, working on legislation and working on judicial processes of the church. Mm-hmm. And that is the place where I live and work, and I like it. The fact that I'm not accepted real well in either end of the spectrum is not a concern for me.
I appreciate all this sharing, Lonnie. I have been so grateful for this podcast and the ability to have conversations with people, often about their stories and the stories that they're taking with them into the bar of the conference in 2024, or just the stories that they're holding, whether they're going to be a delegate or not. And so often there is this line, I think, where the labels just don't fit. And not always because we're trying to push against anybody's framework, sort of like how people could push against the compatibilist language and things like that. I don't think that that's so much it, but I do think that so much of where we are is personal, and you don't have a label for the personal necessarily. It's been the journey that you've been on, and it's where you land on very specific parts of who we are, not just as United Methodists, but as human beings. So I appreciate you sharing all of that. I did want to pick up one piece of what I heard you say about the ways that our church, and I believe the word you use is in defiance of the traditional plan at the moment. The traditional plan being what is the Book of Discipline primarily. It's in the Book of Discipline. And do you see actions being taken directly against those prohibitions? If you just speak a little bit more to that sense of defiance of.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm pleased to do that, Derek. Without naming any names, I know that there are, in fact, I would say even most, not just many, but most of the clergy who serve in the Western jurisdiction, and we're not the only one, there are other parts of the church, are openly making themselves available for performing same-sex unions and weddings, as they're permitted to do. I mean, that's the law of the land now. The United States has equalized marriage for gay and lesbian people as well as for straight people. And that's being done openly, and I'm going to say defiantly, just use the same word again. And moreover, when charges are brought, which they have been, there has been no moratorium. There's been a lot of talk about moratoria, but there's none in place. You can't find a letter that the Council of Bishops has ever issued saying there's no moratorium. Doesn't exist, and been declared. But nevertheless, when charges are brought, our bishops are just sitting on them. They're not acting on them. That's a defiance because the Judicial Council has declared that they have to do this. Well, they say, well, how are you going to enforce that, Judicial Council? And they can't. They don't have any enforcement mechanism. So yes, the bishops are in defiance of this requirement that they prosecute as these charges as when they're brought. They're not doing that. Mm-hmm. Now, and many of our churches are making themselves open. That's a part of the ban. The ban is that you can't do this in our churches. Well, that's not being done either. Many of our churches are open to performing these weddings. And again, we have openly gay people serving in clerical positions. This is defiance. My bishop is openly a gay man, and he's not the only one.
Yeah.
You got two of them out here in the West. So yes, we're in defiance of this ban.
Is this, using the word that you used, this defiance, in your opinion, the best way for those of us who disagree with the traditional plan to respond to it?
In this particular case, I would say yes. Now, mind you, there's a little point of discomfort for me with this, and it's only a small point, and it's mostly theoretical rather than practical. Mm-hmm. There's a long history behind the concept of civil disobedience, and we're talking here about ecclesial disobedience in parallel to civil disobedience. Mm-hmm. And part of the formula, and Dr. Martin Luther King endorsed this part, and he lived it himself, is that, yes, you have to point out that this is a bad law. I'm not going to obey this bad law. But then the next step is, in the formula, you take the punishment that the law measures out. By and large, in our current wave of ecclesial disobedience, we don't like the idea of taking the punishment very well. So we've found a way mostly to get away from that. And I'm okay with that. In theory, I still like the theory of the way it was expressed, and the way it came to us from Gandhi and Thoreau before him and King after him. I like the theory. But right now, we have been left no choice. And so I'm comfortable with where we are in our defiance now.
Yeah.
Get away from the punishment if you can.
Yeah, I appreciate that take. I do. Well, let me take it to the other side of it. Traditional plan passes. The traditionalist, primarily represented by the WCA, I think end up getting the message that most of the U.S. portion of the UMC is not happy about it, not interested in receiving it and accepting it. And, fast forward through all the things over the last few years, the GMC launches in May of 2022. In your opinion, is this the best response for traditionalists?
I think the short answer is yes, but I don't want to leave it with the short answer, if that's all right.
Yeah.
The traditionalists, and many of these folks are people I've worked with for a long time in the halls of the church, and very congenially worked with for a long time. They introduced what became paragraph 2553, the exit plan for dissenters, as a path out for progressives. I'm not making that up. That is exactly how that came into be in the Book of Discipline, that the traditionalists who held the power at the General Conference said, we need to give the progressives a way out so we can have the church that we're building here with our adoption of the traditional plan. Because when the first vote came on prioritization of those proposals, it was clear to anybody who was really paying attention that the traditional plan would prevail. From the very first vote, we knew that was going to happen. And so they were preparing the church as they wanted it to be, which included an exit path for progressives who were not content with what that church would look like. Within weeks of the close of General Conference, it became clear that that had misfired, because we would not. And what really was the death knell there was that the centrists, like me and like Adam Hamilton, joined the progressives, and we said, this was an abomination. We will not abide by this. We are not going to continue to exclude our gay sisters and brothers from the participation in the church. And whatever we have to do, that's what we're going to do to defy this plan. And so the traditionalists very soon saw, it's over, we lost it, we got to leave. And up to that point, they thought they were going to stay. They thought they would be the ones to stay, and that the very path they created for the progressives to leave was the one they needed to take. And so, yes, the launch of the Global Methodist Church was an inevitability, as it turned out. We couldn't have seen it ahead of time, of the adoption of the traditional plan at 2019.
Yeah. And it's so interesting just to hear you talk through these things because, this is what we've lived through these last few years on top of COVID and so much that's happened in our country. When you look back over these last few years from the passing of the traditional plan to where we are now with disaffiliations across the U.S. connection, so, I'm sure there's a lot, but is there anything that you're like, gosh, I wish that we had? Is there anything you wish we had done over these last few years that we've not done?
Well, yeah, where we started would be the first one for me, adopting the restructuring plan that we came up with in 2012. Yeah. And somehow fixed what the Judicial Council broke. I wish we had been able to do that, and it would make where we are much easier than what we need to do to get there. It's going to be more painful now than it would have been then. It was going to be painful enough then, but it's really going to hurt now, because going forward, there are several things that are absolutely inevitable that we're going to have to do. We're going to have to regionalize the church. We've already talked some about that. But just as desperately, we're going to need to restructure and somehow reform the episcopacy. We're way too top heavy. And so while we're consolidating the agencies, we're going to have to restructure the episcopacy as well. So those three things: regionalize the church, consolidate and restructure the agencies part of the church, the connectional part of the church, and restructure the episcopacy, which I think will have to include doing away with lifetime election of bishops. And we're going to have to be the same all across the whole church for episcopal leadership. Many of the central conferences already elect bishops for term, and that's the way we're going to have to go for the whole church. So those are the big three that I see. And I think not only do we need to do that, we need to do that in 2024. Those three things have to be done in 2024.
Had Plan UMC been deemed constitutional, or had there been space to get it into compliance, what would have been in place that could have made all of those things easier to accomplish at this part of our story?
We already have fewer general agencies with a smaller leadership structure, and so we wouldn't have to go through that part. And that's the main thing. We can't afford what we got, and so we're going to have either you let it collapse because there's no money there to keep it up, or you intentionally go in on a missional basis and restructure and reduce. It's going to be one or the other.
Right. What is General Conference 2020 that will take place in May of 2024, April and May of 2024? What does that space need to be about?
The three big things: making sure that we regionalize the church, making sure that we have a connectional structure that is nimble enough, small enough, lean enough to go forward in a sustainable way into the future. And the third thing is to reform the episcopacy and turn it into a term election for all bishops worldwide. That's what General Conference 2024, 2020, whatever you want to call it. Those three things. Everything else is peripheral.
Do you have hope for the future of the United Methodist Church?
I do. Yeah, I think we're still one of the strongest institutions in the world. And certainly we have an impact beyond our size. If you measure us against the Catholic Church, half the people of the world are Christian, right? And half of those are Catholic. So compared to that, we're just a flea on the tail of the dog kind of thing. But we make an impact way beyond our size. And I think that we have the opportunity to continue that position in the fellowship of Christians around the world.
Yeah. Lonnie Brooks, I want to thank you for joining me today. Thank you for sharing so much. I think one of the gifts you bring to our church is you make us think. And sometimes that is a welcome gift, and sometimes that is, as you have said in other parts that might not have gotten recorded, sometimes that's a thorn in the side of some of us. But I want to thank you. I want to thank you for being willing to step into that space in both agreement and disagreement. I think you really are a partner in holy conferencing that we will continue to need. Whether you're actively serving on the floor of the General Conference or writing things from your home, thank you for your work and your witness, Lonnie.
Thank you, Derek. Appreciated the opportunity to talk with you.
Awesome.
We hope you enjoyed the episode. Bar of the Conference is produced by the team at Wesley's Revival, a ministry of Studio Wesley. Subscribe to this show on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or Google platforms so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.